Yo, I'm Jawn, and I am a music photographer and videographer. I've been touring across the country and more recently the world, photographing bands and artists and music festivals and things like that for the past 4 years or so. And oh my god, it's been 4 years already. And I've had the privilege of working with a lot of really great bands like Good Charlotte, Sum 41, The Used, Rise Against, Goo Goo Dolls. You know, there's a whole bunch. I can't name them all. Although there might be one or two in particular that I might be forgetting. One of the most asked questions that I get almost on a daily basis, whether it be on Instagram, Twitter, email, on a live stream or anything like that, is what are some tips for beginner photographers who want to take better concert photos? Well, that is a lot to unpack, so we're going to get as much as we can covered in the time that we have available. So let's just get started. Now, it's important to realize that true image quality is almost always determined at the moment the photo is taken. And what I mean by that is there's only so much Photoshop that you can do to brighten or clean or sharpen a photo after you've already taken it. So at the end of the day, you're always going to want to try and nail that photo right in camera. Now, there are a ton of different factors and variables that go into getting a good concert photo. There are technical things like camera settings or camera equipment, for example, or there are more subjective things like photo composition or lighting or things like that. But for right now, I'm just gonna focus on the fundamental technical aspects, which are going to be three main things: your aperture, your shutter speed, and your ISO, aka the exposure triangle, or whatever that they're calling it now. Now, the exposure triangle is basically like a universal truth amongst all of photography, and the odds are you most likely have heard of these things before. But if you're just starting out and if you're watching this video, then you may not necessarily know how all of those things pertain to concert photography. Well, this is going to be our crash course guide on how these things relate to concert photography. First, let's start with aperture. There's a thing inside your camera lens called an iris, similar to the one inside your eye, and this iris opens and closes to let light pass through the lens into your camera body so that it can reach the camera sensor, or like your retina. For this analogy, I think. An aperture is the measurement of how wide or closed the iris is, also referred to as the f-stop. For reference, the lower that your f-stop number is, like f1.4 for example, the wider the opening is. Whereas the higher that your f-stop number is, like f8 for example, the smaller that opening is. And I know that can be a little confusing at first, it takes a little while to get used to, but what's more important than just knowing what those numbers are is knowing how those numbers affect your concert photography. And well, how do they affect your concert photography? Well, concert venues are usually very dark. Most clubs have very little to no lighting available, so ideally you would want to get a lens that can get super duper wide. That way you're letting in as much light as possible in order for your camera sensor to be able to read and see what's going on in the room. Think about how cats can basically see in the dark. Their pupils dilate so much that it allows them to see things better in the dark even when there's little to no light. It's kind of like the same concept. And you're mostly going to be looking at prime lenses if you're going to try and shoot at an aperture that's about f1.8 or more. Whereas zoom lenses usually only go down to about f2.8 or so, and while that's not exactly terrible, you definitely aren't getting as much light as you would with a prime. This is why most concert photographers usually prefer to shoot with prime or fixed focal lengths than they would with zoom, because it lets you get more light. The next thing is shutter speed. So there's a shutter, or a window so to speak, inside of your camera body that blocks light from reaching the camera sensor. And shutter speed refers to exactly how quickly that shutter opens and closes whenever you take a photo. This opening allows light that passes through your lens into your camera body in very short bursts. So whereas aperture controls how much light is getting passed through the lens, your shutter speed determines how long your camera sensor is exposed to that light. And this opening duration is measured measured in fractions of a second. So for example, a 1/250 shutter speed is only allowing light to pass through at 1/250ths of a second, which is much faster than, let's say, 1/50 shutter speed, which only allows light to pass in for 1/50th a second, or 1/5 the speed. And the longer that it's open for, the more light that goes in, and the shorter that it's open for, the less light that goes in. That affects your exposure. And this is very important to concert photography for a couple of reasons, because one, when you have that shutter open for longer periods of time, you're allowing more light to come in. And two, you're dealing with very high energy, very high intensive environments. You have artists running around, jumping onto things, jumping off of things, and you have production things like confetti or cryo bursts or things like that. And if your shutter speed is set fast enough, then you could essentially freeze these moments in time without introducing a whole lot of motion blur. Usually people don't recommend going lower than around 1/250th of a second if you don't want to create motion blur from like guitar playing or singing, for example. But keeping your shutter at a higher rate also helps prevent against camera shake, which is introduced from shaky hands, especially when you're zoomed in really far and handshakes become way more prevalent. But keep in mind, you can get sharper photos by having a faster shutter speed, but the faster your speed is, the less amount of time your sensor has whenever it's trying to consume light, therefore resulting in a lower exposure. So to compensate for that, you're going to want to open up your aperture as much as possible, allowing as much light to get in there, so when that shutter opens and closes super duper fast, there's as much light available to the sensor. Are we following so far? I'm hoping this makes sense. Now the last thing in this exposure love triangle is the ISO. And ISO is a blessing and a curse. For concert photographers, it's mainly a curse, because ISO digitally increases your camera sensor's sensitivity to light. And when you're photographing in a dark venue environment, you often need to crank that ISO up in order to better see in the dark. And you would think that's a great thing to digitally increase that brightness. However, the reason why it's a curse is because whenever you start getting into the higher ISO ranges of like 3200 or 6400, for example, you start introducing what's called noise. You know noise, like that gross muddiness, that like digital artifact, noisy, gross graininess that most likely would not get you a whole lot of likes on Instagram. Well, most of that usually gets introduced whenever you have a high ISO. But having noise isn't always necessarily a bad thing. In fact, some photographers prefer to have some noise in their image in order to give it less of like a digital photo look, as it emulates the grain that you would see whenever you're shooting with a film camera. But however, too much noise and too much digital artifact can ruin a good photo. It can make it less sharp, it can make it less defined, and just overall less pleasing to look at. So in my opinion, the ISO is usually the fallback option of the three settings. When your aperture is wide open and your shutter speed is set right and you're still not getting bright enough photos, that's when you go in and start upping up that ISO a little bit. Now, of course, some cameras are better than others when it comes to ISO sensitivity. Most entry-level cameras usually struggle around that 3200 ISO point, whereas some pro cameras can go to 6400 or 12,000 and above and still retain some decent quality. But whether you're shooting with this camera or that, it's good to know how it's going to affect your image anyway. So that, in essence, is the exposure triangle. It's important to know as a photographer how these three elements will ultimately affect how your photo comes out. And as you can see, you can't really affect one part of the triangle without it affecting another. They all work in unison in order to achieve whatever look that you're trying to go for. But there is one more topic that I need to talk about, especially if you're just starting out and you don't know this already, and that's the importance of shooting raw. Now, you've probably heard this before, but in case you don't know exactly what it means, shooting raw refers to the actual file type that's created whenever you snap a photo. Most people are more familiar with the file type JPEG because that's the one that's more universally used online due to its small file size, but photographers really don't want to shoot in JPEG, especially concert photographers, because JPEG files already have everything hard baked into the photo already. Exposure, white balance, color, everything is already processed and baked into the photo. It's done. The cake is baked. You can't go and remove an egg or add an egg or do anything after it's already done. I mean, you could, but it's not really gonna achieve what you want. Raw file types, on the other hand, preserve all of the photo information and data that you would possibly need in order to import it into Photoshop or Lightroom and do all of the editing that you could possibly want. Was your photo a little too dark? Well, it's a lot easier to increase your exposure when you have that much data. Or if your white balance was a little bit off, fix it. You can change it. RAW retains so much data that a lot of this photo manipulation is made possible because it's not processed and not condensed. That does mean that RAW file types are significantly larger, so if you're shooting with a smaller SD card, you might want to increase that if you're going to start shooting in RAW, which I do recommend. So check and see if your camera does support RAW file types. Most DSLRs or cameras with interchangeable lenses do support RAW. However, some entry-level cameras or point-and-shoots, for example, usually don't. So then you'll have to practice a little bit more with just JPEGs for now. But if you do have RAW, start shooting with it, start experimenting with it, put it inside of Lightroom or Photoshop or whatever, and start seeing how far your editing can go now that you have way more information to work with. And that's gonna be it for now. Like I said, there's just so much involved with concert photography because really you are practicing all different types of photography in really challenging conditions. I mean, you're literally shooting portraits of band members while they're on stage with different lighting conditions and they're moving around. You're trying to catch a lot of high energy moments of people running around, similar to the way that a sports photographer would. Or even if you're just trying to photograph the entire environment of the venue and the crowd and the balconies and the production and things like that. That's similar to like architecture photography when you're trying to capture a whole lot of scenery in one image. And this is all happening while the lights are flashing, the colors are changing, band members are jumping off of stage into the crowd, and you have to be there ready for it whenever it happens. And probably the craziest thing about all of this is you usually have 3 minutes to capture all of it. Yeah, that's it. You usually get maybe 3 songs at the very beginning of the concert to get every single thing you need, and then you're out of the photo pit. So you need to know all of these things, you need to practice it. It all has to be muscle memory so that when you're down there, you're not worrying about, you know, what settings is which as much as you are making sure that you're getting every moment that you need. Well, I hope you enjoyed this somewhat brief introduction to camera basics as it relates to concert photography. If you have any additional questions or would like to see more specific concert photography related topics in a future video, then just let me know down in the comments and make sure to subscribe for whenever I eventually put them out. And lastly, make sure to like the video if you too also miss going to shows. All right, bye.